Hi guys, it's Misty from the Book Rat, and I am back with another Austen and August video. This time we're taking a look at some of the more unusual Austen retellings that I've read. There are hundreds, probably thousands, of Austen retellings out there, and somehow over the last year I've managed to read some of the more unusual ones that I've ever read in my life. Maybe people are starting to branch out a bit more from the traditional, I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, they went some different places this time around. And I thought I would tell you about some of the ones that I've read recently and highlight some others that will give you a totally different perspective or world or just shake things up in general if you're looking for an Austen retelling that is not like one you've read before. Now, I'm not saying that a total shakeup is completely new to the Jane Austen fan fiction genre. I mean, we did have the whole vampires and zombies and sea monsters trend of like 2012 or whatever. So, I mean, it's not, you know, it's not totally out of the realm, but most retellings tend to be very traditional. Whether they are set in Regency times or whether they are set in modern times, they still tend to follow a pretty standard format. They follow the plot pretty well. They follow the characters and who they are at their core. They might tweak some things that will send them off in a totally different direction. For the most part, they're kind of traditional even when they're not. But these stories that I'm going to talk about today are anything but, while still maintaining some core of Austen-esque truth, I guess. And towards the end of last year, right after Austen and August, when I was still binge reading everything Austen that I could get my hands on because I was just in that mode, I ended up reading 3 pretty much back to back. 2 of those titles are by Abigail Reynolds, and the first one I'm going to talk about is called Mr Darcy's Enchantment. Now this one is a sort of fairy retelling, a very fae retelling of Pride and Prejudice that kind of mashes up Pride and Prejudice with A Midsummer Night's Dream. And it strives to present a kind of parallel England that's going on and reasons Lizzie is who she is and how she is, and reasons that her and Darcy would work together so well. The way that it picks apart the story and pulls pieces together to make them work on this sort of fairy fae level is really fascinating to me. It's also just a fun story at its heart. It doesn't really follow the pattern of Pride and Prejudice. It's not a direct retelling of all the plot points, just with fae injected. It's really its own thing, using the characters as the core elements and some key plot points, but mostly inventing its own new world, its own new system of the way that everything fits together. It's kind of like puzzle pieced back together to form a different picture that is similar. I don't know how else to describe it. I think because of that, it kind of works on 2 different levels, suited to 2 different audiences. So if you are a super fan and you've read Pride and Prejudice a ton, you're going to get all these Easter eggs and be able to read it on one level. It is different from how you would read it and interpret it if you are not a Pride and Prejudice fan, if you haven't read it, if you're not familiar with Jane Austen. I think you could still read this. Maybe ideal if you like the fae or if you like Midsummer Night's Dream. And though you'd be missing those kind of Pride and Prejudice Easter eggs, it would still work as a complete story. So I think it kind of is interesting having those parallel tracks that are perfectly geared to 2 different types of audience. The other one that I want to talk about by Abigail Reynolds is called Conceit and Concealment. And though on its surface this is a more traditional retelling, it's not fairies, it's not modern, there are no zombies or werewolves or vampires or any of that. In this one, the war is much more present. Though the Napoleonic Wars are going on in Pride and Prejudice, and they obviously are touched on a bit in the fact that there's a militia and everybody's like a soldier. For the most part, that's kind of just background. It doesn't really brush their lives too much. It just kind of moves some of the pieces into place. This shifts the story so that they're right in the thick of things, where people stand and how involved they are in patriotism and espionage and double crosses and things like that. Those kind of are the track that all of the plot points take, and they're fitted in very well. I don't want to give anything away, but why certain characters do certain things lines up with their sort of part in the Napoleonic Wars, and it's just really fascinating and not like any other retelling that I personally have read. There might be another one out there. As I've mentioned, there are a million, but I just found the whole thing very interesting, and I found it an interesting basis for why Darcy would be interested in Lizzie and why they would kind of butt heads, and it's just all very fascinating to me. A really interesting tack to take. Similarly to Conceit and Concealment is The Unforgettable Mr Darcy by Victoria Kincaid, which also touches much more on the Napoleonic Wars. It's totally different in that most of it is set in France. There is espionage, there is violence, there are double agents, and Elizabeth, who accidentally ended up in France, has amnesia. So it's a totally different take. It approaches it much differently. I think you probably would need at least a minimal familiarity with Pride and Prejudice, but who doesn't have a minimal familiarity with Pride and Prejudice? This one is mostly set away from everything else, so you're removed from all of those familiar locations, all those familiar characters, because it's really just Darcy and Lizzie in a foreign country for the bulk of the book. That just on its own takes you in a totally different direction and is fascinating to see how it plays out. So it's one of the more traditional ones, but oddball enough that I think it fits as a unique, unusual retelling. So those are 3 that I've read recently that just were really, really different from others that I'd read that got me thinking about this topic. And there are a few more that I would like to mention that I have talked about in the past that are definitely among the more unusual Austen retellings, and that I highly recommend if you are looking for something that is a little more off the beaten path and a little more strange, unusual, creative, quirky, whatever it may be. Though I said I wasn't going to talk about any of the werewolves or zombies or vampires or any of that, I will say the Mr Darcys Dragon series by Maria Grace is totally different, totally unique take on the story. As are most of her retellings, she really likes to take a what if in a completely new direction, even if it is more traditionally set and traditionally told. But this one is specifically about dragons, and the way they're incorporated and the way the dragons kind of inform Regency society is super, super fascinating to me, so definitely one to check out, especially if you like dragons or the kind of weirdness that would bring. For Darkness Shows the Stars by Diana Peterfriend is a far futuristic and very, very different retelling that I think you could easily read with absolutely no familiarity with Austen at all, and I'm sure plenty of people have read it, even that like Austen, and didn't realize that it was a retelling, but it is an Austen retelling, and a fascinating one, and a very well done one. If you're wanting something that is non-traditional but not too out of the box, Longbourn by Jo Baker is the only retelling that I know of that is actually told from completely different characters. This is told from the behind closed doors, below stairs staff that see all of this stuff going on, and they have their own lives to live. It's not my favorite, but I know it was highly regarded by a lot of people, and it is definitely interesting. It gives you a totally different perspective, but also a different tone, which I think is where it kind of went a little bit wrong for me, but still really interesting. And there are a few that take a little bit more of a fabulist or magical realist light tack. Ones that put the reader into the story, I guess. Things like Lost in Austen, which is a choose your own adventure, so you're really actually in the story. Or the Confessions of a Jane Austen Addict series by Laura Vera Rigler. Although it's not the reader that's in the story. You know, it's a modern woman that's kind of swapping places with someone in the Regency era, and that sort of makes it a little bit more reader insert. So if you've ever wondered, what would you do? How would you act? That might be kind of the pick for you. Or things like Ostentatious and Ostensibly Ordinary by Alyssa Goodnight, which kind of use Jane in a fairy godmother sense, almost, I'm gonna say. A kind of oracular framework to the story, and something that pushes the story along in a certain direction, but it's not necessarily like a direct retelling, super dependent on plot points and characters. It's its own thing that's kind of got a guiding hand of Austen. So just some interesting different ways, I guess, that you can go with a totally different approach to Jane Austen fanfiction. I'm sure there are plenty more. I would love to hear yours in the comments if you know of any that you've read and loved, or any that are coming out, because I think it's becoming more of a trend to push the envelope a little bit more. If there is any other sort of theme within Austen retellings that you would like me to talk about, contemporary retellings or retellings that aren't Pride and Prejudice, anything like that, let me know in the comments, because I think there's a lot to say on a lot of different Austen topics, and I'm willing. I'm ready to go there. But that is all for this Austen and August video. I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. Everything I've talked about will be listed and linked in the description below, but that is all for now. As always, thank you guys for watching, and of course, happy reading!